The lock did not turn. Clara Bennett stood on the front steps of the only home she had ever known, her key jammed uselessly in a brass keyhole that refused to yield. Behind her, a moving truck idled at the curb, its engine grumbling like it already knew what was coming. She tried the key again, twisting harder, but the mechanism inside had been changed. Someone had made sure of that. The door opened before she could knock. Margaret Bennett stood in the frame, dressed in black silk despite the summer heat, her face arranged into an expression of practiced sorrow that did not reach her eyes. "You shouldn't be here, Clara," Margaret said, her voice smooth and cold like ice sliding across marble. "This is a private moment for the family." "I am family," Clara said, though even as she spoke the words she heard how thin they sounded. Margaret's daughter, Vivian, appeared behind her mother, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Stepfamily," Vivian corrected. "There's a difference, sweetheart, a big one." 3 days earlier, Edmund Bennett had been alive. Clara had sat beside his hospital bed, holding his thin hand while machines beeped their steady rhythm, and he had looked at her with eyes that seemed to be trying to say something he could not find the strength to say. She had thought it was love. She had thought it was goodbye. She had not known it was a warning. Now he was gone, buried that morning under a gray sky that seemed to match the mood of everyone at the funeral except, strangely, Margaret, who had worn a small, satisfied smile during the entire service, as if she were attending the closing of a business deal rather than the burial of her husband. Clara had noticed it. She had told herself she was imagining things, that grief made people strange, that surely a woman who had shared 15 years of marriage with her father would not smile at his grave. But standing here now, locked out of her own house 2 hours after the funeral ended, she understood that she had not imagined anything at all. "There's been a mistake," Clara said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I live here. My room is upstairs. My things are upstairs." "Your things," Margaret said, "have already been packed." She gestured with one manicured hand toward a single battered suitcase sitting on the porch, as though it had appeared there on its own, as though she had nothing to do with placing it there. "Everything else in this house belongs to me and Vivian now. Your father made that very clear before he passed." "That's not possible. He would never." "The will was read this afternoon, dear," Margaret interrupted, her tone sweetening into something almost pitying which was somehow worse than open cruelty. "You should have come. Oh, wait. No one told you the time. How careless of us." Vivian laughed, a short, bright sound with no warmth in it at all. Clara felt her chest tighten, a slow, crushing pressure, as if the air itself had turned against her. She thought of every dinner at this table, every laugh shared in the kitchen, every small kindness she had believed connected this family together, and she understood now that all of it had been an illusion she alone had believed in. "What did he leave me?" she asked, because some stubborn, unbroken part of her refused to simply walk away without knowing. Margaret's smile widened by a fraction, and that was when Clara knew the answer would hurt. "A field," Margaret said. 60 acres of dirt and rock out past Miller's Creek. Nothing on it but weeds and an old shack that should have been torn down 20 years ago. I believe the lawyer called it Hollow Creek." She paused, letting the words settle like a blade finding its mark. "He left you land no one wants, Clara. I suppose even in death, your father knew exactly what you were worth to this family." The words landed harder than a slap. Clara's eyes burned, but she refused, absolutely refused, to let this woman see her cry. She had cried enough in the last 3 days to last a lifetime, and she would not hand Margaret the satisfaction of one more tear. "Take your suitcase," Margaret said, already stepping back into the house, already treating the conversation as finished. "And don't come back here. This house is no longer your concern." The door shut. The lock clicked, loud and final in the quiet afternoon. Clara stood alone on the porch for a long moment, staring at the dark wood grain of the door as though it might somehow open again, as though this might still turn out to be some cruel misunderstanding that would resolve itself. It did not open. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet. A car passed, its driver glancing at her with mild curiosity before looking away, uninterested in a stranger's private disaster. She picked up the suitcase. It was lighter than she expected, and when she opened it right there on the steps, she found that Margaret's idea of everything amounted to a handful of clothes, a framed photograph of Clara as a child sitting on her father's shoulders, and nothing else. No jewelry, no keepsakes. No trace of the 20 years she had spent believing this was her home. Clara sat down on the top step, suitcase beside her, and allowed herself exactly 1 minute to feel the full weight of what had happened. 1 minute of grief for her father, for the house, for the family she had believed she had. Then she stood, because there was nowhere else to sit and nothing to be gained from sitting longer. She had no car of her own. Margaret controlled the vehicles as she controlled everything else now. She had her phone, with a dwindling battery and a bank account that held barely enough to last a month. She had one address written on a piece of paper the lawyer had pressed into her hand after the will reading, which she had attended only briefly before Margaret's assistant ushered her out with murmured excuses about a private family matter. Hollow Creek, 60 acres, an old shack. It was, by every account she had heard, worthless. She began to walk, suitcase wheels rattling over the uneven sidewalk, the summer sun pressing down on her shoulders like a hand trying to push her lower and lower until she disappeared entirely. She did not know, not yet, that the very thing everyone had called worthless was about to become the most dangerous, most valuable secret in the county, and that Margaret's cruelty on this porch would one day be the reason everything unraveled. For now, she only knew that she had nowhere to sleep tonight, no family left who claimed her, and a long road ahead to a piece of land she had never even seen. A bus stop sign came into view 2 blocks down, its metal pole leaning slightly from years of wind and neglect. Clara checked her phone. The last bus toward the rural routes left in 40 minutes. She quickened her pace, suitcase bumping against her leg, her mind spinning through everything that had happened in the last 3 days, trying and failing to make sense of a world that had turned upside down so quickly. She thought about calling someone. A friend, perhaps, someone from the small circle she had kept during her father's illness, when she had spent so much time at his bedside that her social life had quietly withered. But what would she say? My stepmother locked me out of my own house and gave me a swamp. It sounded absurd even inside her own head, the kind of story people would not believe unless they saw it themselves. At the bus stop, an elderly man sat on the bench, a newspaper folded beneath his arm. He glanced at her suitcase, at her red-rimmed eyes, and offered a small, kind nod, the sort of gesture strangers give each other when words feel unnecessary. Clara nodded back and sat at the far end of the bench, staring down the empty road, waiting for the bus that would carry her toward a life she had never planned for and could not yet imagine. The paper the lawyer had given her was still folded in her coat pocket. She pulled it out now, smoothing the creases with trembling fingers, and read it again, though she had already memorized every word. Property known as Hollow Creek, 60.4 acres, County Road 9, past the old Miller's Creek Bridge. Deed transferred in full to Clara Bennett, effective immediately upon the death of Edmund Bennett. Beneath the address, in her father's own handwriting, added as a note the lawyer said Edmund had insisted upon just weeks before he passed, were 7 words that Clara had read a dozen times without understanding. Everything I could not say is there. She did not know what he meant. She assumed in that moment that it was simply the sentimental scrawl of a dying man, a father trying to soften the blow of an inheritance he knew would look like an insult beside the mansion, and the company shares he was leaving to his second wife and stepdaughter. She folded the paper again and slid it back into her pocket, and did not yet understand that those 7 words were the truest, most important sentence her father had ever written to her. The bus arrived in a groan of brakes and exhaust. Clara paid her fare with cash she could not really spare, hauled her suitcase up the steps, and took a seat by the window as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, carrying her past the neighborhood she had grown up in, past the shuttered shops of the town center, past the last familiar landmarks of her old life, and out toward the quiet, unknown roads that led to Hollow Creek. She watched the houses grow farther apart, the sidewalks give way to gravel shoulders, the manicured lawns replaced by open fields and leaning fences. Somewhere out there, past a bridge she had never crossed, was a piece of land everyone believed to be worthless. Clara did not know it yet, but she was riding directly toward the truth her father had spent years protecting, the secret that had cost him more than anyone realized, and the discovery that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone who had ever underestimated her. The bus rattled on, the sun sinking lower, and Clara Bennett, alone and grieving and utterly certain that her life had just fallen apart, had no idea that it was only just beginning. The bus dropped Clara at a crossroads where the paved road ended and gravel began, and from there she had no choice but to walk. The driver had warned her that Hollow Creek was another 2 miles down County Road 9, past the old Miller's Creek Bridge, and that no bus or taxi ran that far out. She thanked him, stepped down into the dust, and watched the bus pull away until its taillights disappeared around a bend, leaving her utterly alone with a suitcase, a folded piece of paper, and the last hour of daylight. She walked. The gravel crunched under her shoes, and crickets began their evening chorus in the tall grass on either side of the road. The air smelled of dry earth and distant rain, and somewhere far off a dog howled once and fell silent. Clara kept her eyes on the road ahead, refusing to think too hard about how strange it felt to be walking alone into the dark toward a place she had never seen, carrying everything she owned in a single suitcase. The Miller's Creek Bridge appeared just as the sky turned the deep orange of sunset. It was an old wooden structure, its boards gray and weathered, spanning a narrow creek that gurgled quietly beneath it. Clara paused at the center of the bridge and looked down at the water, at the way the last light caught the ripples and turned them to fire, and for a moment she almost felt something like peace. Then a sound behind her made her spin around. A truck had stopped at the near end of the bridge, its headlights cutting through the dusk. A man leaned out of the driver's side window, watching her. "You lost," he called out. His voice was not unkind, but there was something careful in the way he studied her, as though trying to place her. "I'm looking for a property called Hollow Creek," Clara said, keeping her voice even, keeping several feet of distance between herself and the truck. She had grown up in a city where a lone woman on an empty road learned caution early. The man's eyebrows rose. "Hollow Creek, old Bennett's place." "Yes, he was my father." Something shifted in the man's expression, a flicker of surprise, maybe even sympathy. "I heard he passed. Sorry for your loss." He opened the truck door and stepped down, and in the fading light Clara could see he was perhaps 50, weathered and broad-shouldered, with the look of a man who worked outdoors for a living. "Name's Walter Higgins. I farm the land next to yours, such as it is. Your father and I were friendly, back before he moved into town full-time." Clara relaxed slightly, though not completely. Clara Bennett. "You walking all the way out there tonight, on foot, with that thing?" Walter nodded at her suitcase. "I don't have much choice." Walter studied her a moment longer, then sighed and gestured toward the truck bed. "Get in. I'll drive you the rest of the way. Wouldn't feel right letting a young woman walk County 9 after dark. We get coyotes out this way, and worse." Clara hesitated. Every instinct that had kept her safe in the city told her not to accept rides from strangers. But exhaustion, grief, and the darkening sky pressed against her, and something in Walter's manner, the plain concern in his voice, convinced her he meant no harm. She climbed into the passenger seat, suitcase wedged at her feet, and the truck rumbled forward across the bridge. "Been a long time since anyone lived out at Hollow Creek," Walter said as they drove, gravel popping beneath the tires. "Your father used to come out now and then, mostly alone, mostly at odd hours. Never brought his new wife or her girl, not once that I saw. Always thought that was strange." "He never mentioned this place to me," Clara admitted. "Not once." "Well, he mentioned you," Walter said. "Not often, but when he did, there was something in his voice, like he was carrying something heavy he couldn't set down. He glanced sideways at her. "You look like him, you know." Around the eyes. Clara did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, watching the dark fields roll past the window, the occasional light of a distant farmhouse the only break in the growing blackness. The truck slowed and turned off the gravel road onto a narrower dirt track, barely more than 2 ruts worn into the grass. Ahead, in the glow of the headlights, Clara saw it for the first time: Hollow Creek. A field of tall, unkempt grass stretched out under the darkening sky, bordered by a broken wooden fence that leaned at odd angles. In the middle distance stood a small farmhouse, its paint long faded, one shutter hanging loose and knocking softly against the wall in the evening breeze. Behind it, she could just make out the shape of an old well and a scattering of outbuildings in various states of collapse. It looked exactly as Margaret had described: worthless. Walter stopped the truck at the edge of the property. "This is as far as I can take you. Track's too rough past here for the truck." He reached into the glove box and pulled out a flashlight, handing it to her. "Keep this. House probably doesn't have working power, not after all these years empty. There's a lantern inside, last I knew, and matches in the kitchen drawer if the mice haven't gotten to them." "Thank you," Clara said, and meant it more than the simple words could convey. "For the ride, for the flashlight, for not treating me like a charity case." Walter smiled, a brief, genuine expression. "Your father was a good man, whatever troubles came with his second marriage. If you need anything, my place is a mile up the road, the one with the red barn. Don't be a stranger." He waited until she had climbed out and started up the dirt track toward the farmhouse, before turning the truck around and driving back the way they had come, his taillights shrinking into the darkness until they vanished entirely. Clara stood alone at the edge of her inheritance, suitcase in one hand, flashlight in the other, the tall grass whispering around her ankles in the night wind. The farmhouse loomed ahead, dark and silent, and for a moment she felt a shiver of unease that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. It was the feeling of being watched, sharp and sudden, prickling at the back of her neck. She swept the flashlight beam across the field, but saw nothing except grass and shadow and the crooked silhouette of the old fence. She told herself it was nerves, grief, exhaustion playing tricks on an unfamiliar landscape. She walked on toward the house. The front door was unlocked, its wood swollen and warped so that she had to shoulder it open with a groan of hinges that had not moved in years. Inside, the flashlight revealed a single main room thick with dust, a stone fireplace choked with old ash, a narrow staircase leading to what she assumed was a loft or a second floor, and furniture draped in yellowed sheets like sleeping ghosts. The air smelled of dust and old wood, and something faintly metallic she could not place. She found the lantern Walter had mentioned on a shelf near the kitchen, and after several attempts with damp matches, managed to coax a flame to life. The warm glow pushed back the darkness, revealing a kitchen with a hand pump for water, a wood stove black with age, and cabinets that creaked when she opened them, revealing nothing but a scatter of mouse droppings and one rusted tin cup. Clara set the suitcase down in the middle of the main room and simply stood there for a moment, absorbing the silence, the dust, the crushing weight of everything that had happened in a single day. This was it. This was what her father had left her. A field of weeds and a house full of ghosts, 40 miles from anyone who might call her family. She told herself she would only stay the night, that in the morning she would figure out a real plan, perhaps sell the land for whatever small sum it might fetch, and use the money to start over somewhere else, somewhere she could find work and rebuild a life that did not depend on anyone's charity. She spread a blanket she found in a cedar chest across the least dusty corner of the floor, blew out most of the lantern's flame to conserve the oil, and lay down, staring up at the shadowed ceiling beams, exhaustion finally overtaking grief and fear alike. Just as sleep began to pull her under, a sound reached her ears through the thin walls of the old house. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps in the grass outside, moving slowly, circling. Clara's eyes snapped open. She lay perfectly still, listening, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it could be heard outside. The footsteps paused directly outside the window nearest her head. A long, terrible silence stretched out, broken only by the distant call of a night bird. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps moved away, fading into the darkness beyond the field, until there was nothing left but the whisper of wind through grass and the frantic beat of her own heart. Clara did not sleep again that night. She sat upright against the wall, lantern relit and turned up bright, flashlight gripped in one hand, watching the door until the first gray light of dawn crept through the grimy windows and chased the shadows away. Only then did exhaustion finally claim her, pulling her down into a shallow, uneasy sleep filled with half-formed dreams of her father's voice, repeating the same 7 words over and over. "Everything I could not say is there." She woke a few hours later to bright sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of a truck engine approaching from the direction of the road. For one heart-stopping moment, she feared the footsteps from the night before had returned in daylight, bold enough now to approach openly. She grabbed the flashlight, useless as a weapon but the only thing within reach, and moved cautiously to the window. It was Walter's truck, rattling up the dirt track with a second figure in the passenger seat, a woman with graying hair and a friendly, weathered face. Clara set down the flashlight and stepped out onto the sagging porch, blinking in the morning light. "Figured you might need supplies," Walter called out as he climbed down. "This is my wife, Margie, not to be confused with anyone unpleasant you might know by a similar name." The woman, Margie, laughed warmly and carried a basket up to the porch, filled with bread, a jar of preserves, and a thermos that smelled of fresh coffee. "Heard about your troubles from Walter last night," she said, her voice gentle. "Figured a girl starting over out here could use a decent breakfast, at the very least." Clara felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion at the simple kindness of strangers who owed her nothing. "Thank you," she managed. "Both of you. I don't know how to repay this." "You don't need to repay kindness," Margie said, waving off the thought. "Just promise you'll come to us if you need help. This land's been empty a long time. Folks around here will be curious about you, and not all of them as friendly as us." Something in the way she said it made Clara pause. "What do you mean?" Walter and Margie exchanged a brief glance, the kind married couples share when deciding who should speak first. "There's always been talk about this place," Walter said finally, choosing his words carefully. "Your father bought it decades ago for almost nothing, back when nobody wanted worthless farmland like this. But he held on to it year after year, paying the taxes, never selling, never developing it, never even farming it properly. People wondered why a man with his money would keep a useless field like this one." He paused, looking out over the tall grass swaying in the morning breeze. "Some folks always figured there had to be a reason, something he wasn't saying." Clara's mind flashed back to the footsteps in the night, the deliberate, careful sound of someone circling her house in the dark. "Last night," she said slowly, "I heard someone outside, walking around the house. It stopped right by my window." Margie's friendly expression tightened with concern. Walter's jaw set into a hard line. "Probably nothing," he said, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe his own words. "Could have been a deer or old Pete's dog wandering loose again. But Clara, listen to me. If it happens again, you get in touch with us right away, day or night. This land might look empty and worthless to some folks, but empty land still draws attention out here, especially land that sat untouched for this many years." Clara looked out at the field, at the tall grass hiding who knew what beneath its surface, at the old well standing sentinel near the house, at the horizon where the dirt track disappeared toward the main road, and felt, for the first time since Margaret had locked her out of her childhood home, something other than grief and fear. She felt curiosity, a slow, deep, unshakable sense that Walter was right, that there was a reason her father had held onto this land for decades, paid its taxes without complaint, and left her a note that spoke of everything he could not say. Whatever that reason was, she intended to find it. After Walter and Margie left, promising to check in again within a few days. Clara spent the morning walking the boundaries of her new property, trying to understand exactly what she had inherited. The 60 acres stretched further than she had realized the night before, rolling gently toward a distant tree line, the grass tall enough in places to brush against her waist. She found the remains of an old fence marking the property edge, posts leaning and wire rusted through in places, and beyond it, the neighboring farmland belonging to Walter, neat rows of crops standing in sharp contrast to the wildness of her own inheritance. Near the center of the field stood the old stone well Clara had glimpsed in the darkness the night before. In daylight she could see it more clearly, a circular structure built from fitted stones, its wooden cover cracked and partially collapsed, a rusted iron bucket still hanging from a frayed rope inside. She peered down into the darkness and saw only the faint glimmer of water far below, and beyond that nothing but shadow. It was while walking near the well, examining the ground for any sign of the footsteps she had heard the previous night, that Clara noticed something odd. A section of ground several feet from the well looked different from the surrounding earth, slightly sunken, the grass growing in a thinner, paler shade than elsewhere in the field. She knelt down and brushed her fingers across the surface, and felt beneath the thin layer of soil something hard and flat. Curiosity overtook caution. Clara returned to the house, found an old garden spade leaning in the corner of a collapsing shed, and carried it back to the strange patch of ground. She began to dig, carefully at first, then with growing urgency as the spade struck something solid only a few inches down. It was a flat stone, larger than a dinner plate, clearly placed there deliberately rather than naturally occurring. Beneath it, wedged into a shallow hollow lined with what looked like old canvas to keep out moisture, sat a rusted metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, its surface pitted with age but its latch, remarkably, still intact. Clara's hands trembled as she lifted the box free of the earth and carried it back to the porch, setting it down on the weathered boards with the same care she might have used for something fragile and alive. She worked the latch loose with the edge of the spade, the metal groaning in protest after so many years sealed shut, and finally the lid gave way. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth to protect against the elements, she found a hand-drawn map, its lines faded but still legible, showing what appeared to be the property of Hollow Creek marked with strange symbols she did not immediately recognize. Beneath the map lay a folded letter, the paper yellowed but the ink still dark, written in her father's unmistakable handwriting. Clara sat down heavily on the porch steps, the letter trembling in her hands, and began to read. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then I have passed, and you have found your way to Hollow Creek, and I am sorrier than I can say that I was never brave enough to tell you these things while I still had breath in my body. I have started this letter a dozen times over the years and torn it up each time, afraid of the danger these words might bring to you if the wrong person ever found them first. But I am running out of time, and I would rather you know the truth, even a dangerous truth, than inherit a mystery with no answers at all. Long ago, before you were born, I made a decision that changed the course of my entire life. I came into possession of something valuable, something that certain powerful people believed belonged to them, though the truth of its ownership was far more complicated than they ever admitted. Rather than risk everything in a fight I could not win through lawyers and courts, I hid what I had here, on this land, beneath ground that no one would ever suspect held anything of worth. I bought this field specifically because it appeared worthless. I let it sit untouched, unfarmed, uninteresting to anyone who might look too closely, for exactly that reason. Every year I paid its taxes and told myself that one day, when the danger had passed, I would dig up what I had buried and finally live without fear. But the danger never fully passed, Clara. The people who wanted what I hid did not forget, even after all these years, and I have come to believe, too late, that Margaret may be closer to the truth than I ever intended to let her get. I cannot tell you everything in this letter, in case it falls into the wrong hands before it reaches yours, but I can tell you this. Everything I could not say is there, hidden beneath the very ground you now walk upon. Trust Walter Higgins if you need help. He is one of the few people I have ever truly trusted in this life. Be careful who else you tell. And forgive me, my darling girl, for leaving you a burden instead of the simple, happy inheritance you deserved. With all my love and all my regret. Your father, Edmund. Clara read the letter twice, then a third time, her mind struggling to absorb what her father had written. A treasure, hidden somewhere on this land, valuable enough that people had wanted it badly enough to make her father live in quiet fear for decades. And Margaret, closer to the truth than Edmund had intended. She thought again of the footsteps in the darkness the night before, circling her window with careful, deliberate steps, and felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Someone already knew, or at least suspected, that Hollow Creek held more than empty grass and broken fences. Clara carefully refolded the letter and the map and placed them back inside the metal box, then carried the box inside the farmhouse and hid it beneath a loose floorboard she discovered near the fireplace, the best hiding place she could manage on short notice. She stood in the center of the dusty main room afterward, breathing hard, trying to make sense of a morning that had turned her entire understanding of her father's life upside down. He had not simply left her a worthless field out of neglect, or as a cruel afterthought compared to the mansion and company shares given to Margaret and Vivian. He had left her the one thing he trusted no one else with, a secret he had protected for decades, dangerous enough that he had been afraid to even write about it plainly. She needed answers, and she needed them carefully, without drawing the wrong kind of attention. Walter's name in the letter gave her a place to start, a promise from her father that this one neighbor, at least, could be trusted. Clara changed into sturdier clothes she found among the meager belongings in her suitcase, tucked the folded map into her coat pocket for reference, and set off on foot along the dirt track toward Walter and Margie's farm a mile up the road, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers yet, but that she intended, whatever the cost, to finally uncover. She had not walked more than a quarter mile when she noticed something that stopped her cold in the middle of the track. Fresh tire marks, distinct from Walter's truck, cut through the soft earth near the property's edge, leading toward the tree line at the back of the field before doubling back and disappearing onto the main road. The marks had not been there the previous evening. Someone had driven onto the property sometime during the night or the early morning hours, quietly, while she slept restlessly inside the farmhouse. Clara's pulse quickened. She crouched beside the tire marks, studying them with an intensity she did not know she possessed, memorizing their pattern and width as though the knowledge might somehow protect her. Then she stood, glanced back toward the house standing alone and vulnerable in the wide open field, and quickened her pace toward Walter's farm, no longer walking simply out of curiosity, but out of a growing, undeniable sense that she was being watched, and that whatever her father had buried on that land, someone else wanted it badly enough to come looking in the dead of night. By the time she reached the red barn marking Walter's property, Clara's calm resolve had hardened into something sharper, something closer to determination. Whatever secret her father had died protecting, whatever danger Margaret's closeness to the truth might represent, Clara intended to understand it fully before anyone else had the chance to take it from her, the same way everything else had been taken. She knocked on the farmhouse door, and when Walter answered, wiping his hands on a work rag, his easy smile faded the moment he saw the expression on her face. "Something's happened," he said, not a question but a statement, already reaching for his jacket hanging by the door. "I found something," Clara said. "A letter from my father, entire tracks on my property from last night. I think someone was there, Walter. I think someone knows what he hid." Walter's expression turned grave, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring past her toward the direction of Hollow Creek as though he could see straight across the mile of farmland separating them. "Come inside," he said finally, his voice low and serious. "I think it's time I told you what I actually know." Walter led Clara into a small kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and gestured for her to sit at a scarred wooden table while Margie, sensing the seriousness in her husband's manner, quietly poured 3 cups of coffee and took a seat beside them without a word. "Your father and I go back further than you probably know," Walter began, wrapping both hands around his cup as though drawing warmth from it. "Before he made his money, before the company, before Margaret, Edmund and I worked together on a construction crew, back when we were young men with more ambition than sense. We stayed friends after he moved on to bigger things, even after I settled here to farm. He trusted me with things he never told another living soul." "Did he tell you what he buried out there?" Clara asked, unable to hold back the question any longer. Walter shook his head slowly. "Not exactly. He was careful even with me, but I know enough of the shape of it to tell you what I believe." He took a long sip of coffee, gathering his thoughts. "Years ago, before you were born, your father was involved in a private investment arrangement with a small group of business partners. This was during a time when banks were failing left and right, when a lot of wealthy men lost everything overnight because they trusted institutions that collapsed without warning. Edmund and a few others decided they would never let that happen to them again." "What kind of arrangement?" Clara pressed. "A private vault system," Walter said. "The details are murky even to me, but the general idea was this. A small group of investors pooled resources, real, tangible resources, not paper promises that could vanish with a bank failure, and hid them across several rural properties scattered through the county. Land that looked worthless on the surface, land no one would think twice about, each site holding a portion of the group's combined wealth. The idea was that even if everything else collapsed, even if the entire financial system came crashing down, they would have something solid, something real, buried safely away from anyone's reach." Clara sat back in her chair, the weight of what Walter was describing settling over her slowly. "Gold," she said quietly. "That's what he's talking about. That's what's out there." "I believe so," Walter said. "Though I've never seen it myself, and your father never confirmed it outright, not even to me. What I do know is that the arrangement fell apart eventually, badly, in a dispute among the partners over who owned what share of the combined holdings. There were accusations, lawsuits, threats. One of the men involved, a fellow named Reginald Ashcroft, claimed Edmund had cheated him out of his rightful portion and tried for years afterward to have the courts intervene." "What happened to the lawsuit?" "Sealed," Walter said. "Records locked away by a judge who owed your father some old favor from what I understood at the time. The whole affair went quiet, officially resolved, unofficially never truly settled. Ashcroft passed away himself, must be close to 15 years back now, but he had children. Grandchildren even last I heard. People who might still believe there's a fortune out there rightfully belonging to their family, sitting, buried on land your father bought specifically to hide it from them." Clara felt the pieces beginning to click together, forming a picture darker and more dangerous than she had imagined even after reading her father's letter. "The tire tracks," she said. "The footsteps last night. You think it's someone connected to this Ashcroft family?" "I couldn't say for certain," Walter admitted. "Could be treasure hunters who have heard old rumors and nothing more. Could be someone with a real, personal grudge going back generations. Either way, Clara, I think you need to be very careful about who you trust with what you know, and very careful about being alone out there until you understand more." Margie, who had remained quiet through most of the conversation, finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. "You could stay here with us, dear, just until things feel safer." Clara considered the offer, tempted by the simple comfort of not being alone in an unfamiliar house with strangers creeping around it in the dark. But something in her resisted the idea of retreating, of abandoning the property her father had trusted her with, the secret he had waited his whole life to finally reveal. "Thank you," she said, "but I need to stay at Hollow Creek. If there's really something out there, something my father protected for decades, I need to understand it. I need to find it before anyone else does, especially before Margaret figures out there's more to that field than dirt and weeds." Walter studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his weathered eyes. You've got his stubbornness, that's for certain, he said. All right. If you're staying, then we do this smart. I know a fellow, retired surveyor named Desmond Hale, does private land assessment work, discreet, doesn't ask questions he doesn't need answered. If your father really did hide something specific on that property, a proper survey might help narrow down exactly or without you digging up 60 acres by hand. Can we trust him? I trust him, Walter said. Whether you should is your call to make, but I'll vouch for his discretion at least. Clara nodded, feeling a small measure of relief at having allies in a situation that had grown far more complicated and far more dangerous than she could have imagined just 2 days earlier. There's something else, she said, remembering the map tucked in her coat pocket. She pulled it out and smoothed it across the kitchen table, the faded lines and strange symbols catching the morning light streaming through the window. This was in the box with the letter. I don't understand most of it, but maybe your surveyor friend would. Walter and Margie leaned over the map together, studying the markings with furrowed brows. Several symbols appeared scattered across a rough outline of the property, small crosses and circles whose meaning Clara could not decipher, along with measurements written in her father's cramped handwriting that seemed to reference distances from the old well. This looks like it might be marking specific points, Walter murmured, tracing a finger along one of the measurement lines. Distances from the well may be depths. This isn't the work of a man scattering things randomly. This is deliberate, careful. A knock at the front door made all three of them jump. Margie rose to answer it, and Clara instinctively folded the map and slid it back into her coat. A reflexive caution she had not possessed 24 hours earlier, but that now felt entirely natural. Margie returned a moment later, her expression puzzled. It's for you, Clara. A young man says he's looking for the new owner of Hollow Creek. Clara's heart lurched. She exchanged a wary glance with Walter before following Margie to the front door, where a stranger stood on the porch, perhaps 30 years old, dressed neatly in a collared shirt despite the rural setting, his smile pleasant but somehow too practiced, too rehearsed. Miss Bennet, the man said smoothly, my name is Nathaniel Ashcroft. I believe you and I may have some family history worth discussing. The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Ashcroft. The very name Walter had spoken only minutes earlier, the family who believed they had been cheated out of a fortune decades ago. And now here stood a man claiming that name, smiling at her from the porch as though he had simply come to discuss the weather. I'm sorry, Clara said carefully, keeping her voice neutral, giving away nothing. I don't believe we've met. We haven't, Nathaniel agreed easily, but our fathers knew each other, and I suspect that history didn't end particularly well. He glanced past her toward Walter, who had come to stand protectively in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. Mr. Higgins. Good to see you're still farming this stretch of road. Ashcroft, Walter said, his tone flat and unwelcoming. What business do you have out here? Business, actually, is exactly the right word. Nathaniel's smile did not waver, but something colder flickered behind his eyes. My grandfather, Reginald Ashcroft, spent the last years of his life fighting to recover what he believed was rightfully his, a portion of a shared investment that Edmund Bennett quietly claimed for himself decades ago. My father continued that fight for years quietly, without success, and passed the matter to me before he died. I've spent considerable time and money trying to understand exactly what happened to that investment, and I've recently come to believe it never actually disappeared at all. I believe it was simply hidden. Clara felt her pulse pounding in her throat but forced herself to keep her expression calm, unreadable. I don't know anything about my father's old business dealings, she said. I only just inherited this property 2 days ago. I didn't even know it existed until the will was read. Is that so? Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. That's interesting because I understand you spent quite a lot of time out at that property yesterday and through the night, walking the fields, digging even, according to someone who happened to notice. Ice ran through Clara's veins. Someone had been watching her, closely enough to see her digging up the metal box that morning. The footsteps in the night, the tire tracks at the edge of the property, this man's sudden appearance, all of it connected into a single, unsettling thread. "I was clearing weeds," Clara said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "The property has been neglected for years. That's hardly a mystery worth driving all this way to investigate." Nathaniel's smile widened, though it no longer reached even the pretense of warmth. "Perhaps, or perhaps you've already begun to understand exactly what your father was protecting, and exactly how much it might be worth. I'll be honest with you, Miss Bennet, since honesty tends to save everyone a great deal of time. My family has waited nearly 3 decades for what we believe belongs to us. I would very much prefer to resolve this matter peacefully, between reasonable people, rather than through lawyers and courts and all the unpleasantness that comes with such things." "There's nothing to resolve," Clara said firmly. "I don't know what you're talking about, and even if I did, this property belongs to me now, legally, according to my father's will. Whatever old dispute existed between him and your grandfather has nothing to do with me." "I would advise against being so certain of that," Nathaniel said, his tone shifting into something quieter, more deliberate, almost threatening despite the mild words he chose. "Legal ownership of land is one matter. Rightful ownership of what may or may not be hidden beneath that land is an entirely different question, one my family's lawyers are more than prepared to argue, at length, in whatever court proves necessary. I'd hate to see a young woman, freshly grieving, freshly inherited into a difficult situation, get dragged through years of expensive litigation over a dispute that could be settled far more simply, and far more amicably, with a bit of cooperation." "Are you threatening her?" Walter's voice cut through the tension, hard and sharp as a blade. "Of course not," Nathaniel said smoothly, raising both hands in a gesture of mock innocence. "I'm simply being direct, Mr. Higgins, which I find tends to save everyone considerable trouble in the long run. Miss Bennet, here is my card." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, extending it toward her. Clara did not move to take it, and after a moment he simply set it down on the porch railing instead, unbothered by the small refusal. "When you've had time to think it over, and I suspect you will think about it a great deal, please reach out. I would much rather we work together than against each other." He turned and walked back toward a sleek black car parked at the edge of the road, the kind of vehicle that looked entirely out of place among the farm trucks and gravel roads of the county. Before climbing in, he paused and glanced back at Clara one final time. "Your father was a clever man," he said, "clever enough to hide what he took for over 30 years. But everyone makes mistakes eventually, Miss Bennet. I intend to be there when your father's finally comes to light." The car pulled away, tires crunching over gravel, and disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust, leaving Clara standing frozen on Walter and Margie's porch, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That," Walter said grimly, once the car had vanished from sight, "is exactly the kind of trouble I was hoping you wouldn't have to deal with." "He knows," Clara whispered. "Somehow he already knows I found something." "Or he's guessing and hoping you'll confirm it for him," Margie offered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Either way, dear, you cannot go back out to that property alone tonight. Not after this." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist on her independence, on her right to handle her own inheritance without leaning on the kindness of neighbors she had known for less than a full day. But the memory of Nathaniel's cold, calculating smile, combined with the footsteps circling her window in the darkness the night before, convinced her that stubbornness alone would not be enough to keep her safe. "One night," she agreed reluctantly. "But tomorrow I need to go back. I need to understand what my father hid before people like Nathaniel Ashcroft find it first." Walter nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, then. I'll call Desmond Hale first thing and see if he can come out to survey the property properly, quietly, without drawing more attention than we already have. In the meantime, you'll stay here, and we'll figure out our next move together." That evening, as Margie prepared a simple dinner and Walter made quiet phone calls in the next room, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table, staring down at her father's letter, which she had retrieved from its hiding place before leaving Hollow Creek. She read it again, searching for any detail she might have missed, any clue that might help her understand exactly what Nathaniel Ashcroft's family believed had been stolen from them, and whether her father had truly wronged them or whether the truth was more complicated than a simple story of theft and betrayal. Everything I could not say is there, her father had written. Trust Walter Higgins if you need help. Be careful who else you tell. He had known, even then, writing this letter in whatever private moment he had stolen for himself before illness finally claimed him, that someone might come looking. He had warned her, as best he could, without revealing enough to put her in immediate danger before she even understood what she was protecting. Her phone buzzed unexpectedly on the table beside her, the screen lighting up with a number she did not recognize. Clara hesitated, then answered cautiously. "Clara, oh, thank goodness it's you." The voice on the other end was unmistakably Vivian's, though it carried a warmth Clara had never heard from her stepsister before. "I've been so worried since yesterday. Mother didn't tell me the details of the will, not until after you'd already left, and when I found out what happened, I had to call and check on you. Are you all right?" Clara's guard rose instantly, every instinct honed by 20 years of Vivian's casual cruelty warning her that this sudden concern was almost certainly not what it appeared to be. "I'm fine, Vivian. Surprised to hear from you, honestly." I know, we've never exactly been close," Vivian said, her tone light, almost apologetic. "But you're still my sister in whatever way that counts, and I hated seeing you turned away like that. Mother can be, well, you know how she can be. I just wanted to make sure you had somewhere to go, that you weren't stranded somewhere awful." "I found somewhere," Clara said carefully, offering nothing more specific than that. "That old field father left you. Hollow Creek, wasn't it?" Vivian pressed, her tone still light, still casual, but Clara noticed the question came a beat too quickly, too eagerly for genuine concern alone. "I heard it's practically abandoned out there. Must be strange being all alone in a place like that." "It's fine," Clara repeated, keeping her answers as brief and vague as possible. "I should go, Vivian. I'm having dinner with some neighbors." Of course," Vivian said quickly. "I just wanted to check on you. Maybe we could talk more sometime properly without Mother listening in. I've always felt she treated you unfairly, honestly." Clara ended the call a few moments later, her mind racing. Vivian had never once, in 20 years of sharing a roof, expressed anything resembling sympathy or fairness toward her. This sudden warmth, arriving less than a day after her encounter with Nathaniel Ashcroft, felt far too convenient to be coincidence. Someone had told Vivian and Margaret about Hollow Creek's supposed emptiness, its abandoned state, details that suggested they, too, were curious about what exactly Edmund had left his daughter, and why. Clara set the phone down and stared out the darkened kitchen window toward the distant shape of the tree line separating Walter's farm from her own property, and felt, with growing certainty, that she was no longer facing a single threat, but two, circling from opposite directions, both hungry for whatever secret her father had spent his life protecting. Desmond Hale arrived at Hollow Creek 2 mornings later in a dusty pickup loaded with surveying equipment, a lean, quiet man in his 60s with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a manner of speaking that wasted no words. Walter had vouched for his discretion, and within the first few minutes of watching him work, methodically setting up his instruments along the edge of the field without a single unnecessary question about why a young woman needed her inherited land surveyed so urgently, Clara understood exactly why. She had spent the previous night at Walter and Margie's farm as promised, sleeping fitfully despite the safety of their guest room, her mind circling endlessly around Nathaniel Ashcroft's cold threats and Vivian's suspicious, sudden warmth. By morning she had resolved that hiding would accomplish nothing. If people were already circling Hollow Creek, hungry for whatever her father had buried there. Then her best defense was to understand the secret herself, as quickly as possible, before anyone else could claim it. "Your map here," Desmond said, spreading the faded document across the hood of his truck and studying it with a practiced eye. "These markings aren't random. See this symbol, repeated 3 times. That's a common notation surveyors used decades back for reference points, usually tied to a fixed landmark. You're well, most likely, given how the measurements all seem to radiate outward from roughly that location." "Can you tell where they lead?" Clara asked, watching him trace careful lines across the paper with a pencil, cross-referencing the old markings against measurements he took from the well itself. "Give me a few hours," Desmond said. "This kind of work isn't fast, not if you want it done right. But yes, I believe I can narrow down at least a few likely points." While Desmond worked, methodical and unhurried, Clara occupied herself clearing brush near the farmhouse, though her attention remained fixed on the surveyor's slow progress across the field. Walter had returned to his own farm that morning after helping set up the equipment, promising to check back by evening. And for the first time since arriving at Hollow Creek, Clara found herself essentially alone with a stranger on an isolated property, trusting entirely on Walter's word that Desmond could be relied upon. By early afternoon, Desmond called her over to a spot roughly 40 feet from the old well, where he had driven a small wooden stake into the ground. "Based on the measurements in your father's map," he said, "and cross-referencing against the well as the fixed point, I believe this location and possibly 2 others nearby may correspond to the markings. I can't promise you'll find anything, understand. Old maps like this, drawn by hand, they're not always precise. But it's a reasonable place to start looking, if you're determined to dig." Clara stared down at the small wooden stake, at the innocent patch of overgrown grass surrounding it, and felt a fresh wave of nervous anticipation. Whatever her father had hidden, whatever secret Nathaniel Ashcroft believed had been stolen from his family, might lie just beneath her feet, waiting after decades of silence to finally be uncovered. "Thank you," she said to Desmond, meaning it deeply. "I don't know how to repay this." "Walter already settled the matter of payment," Desmond said simply, packing away his equipment with the same unhurried efficiency he had shown all day. "Just be careful, Miss Bennet. Whatever's out here, if it's what I suspect from the way Walter described the situation, it's the kind of thing that draws dangerous attention. Old money, old grudges, they don't fade the way people hope they will." Desmond left before sunset, and Clara found herself alone at Hollow Creek for the first time since her arrival, standing over the marked spot near the well, torn between the urgent desire to start digging immediately and the exhausted recognition that proper excavation would require more than a single garden spade and the last hour of daylight. She decided, reluctantly, to wait until morning, when Walter had promised to return with proper tools and an extra pair of hands. That night Clara made her bed in the farmhouse once more, lantern burning low beside her, the metal box containing her father's letter and map tucked safely beneath the loose floorboard near the fireplace. She had barely drifted into an uneasy sleep when a sound jolted her fully awake, sharp and unmistakable this time, far closer and far more deliberate than the distant footsteps of 2 nights before. Someone was trying the farmhouse's back door. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs as she sat bolt upright, listening to the soft, persistent rattle of the door handle being tested, followed by a low scraping sound, as though someone was working at the old lock with a tool of some kind. She scrambled silently to her feet, grabbed the flashlight lying beside her makeshift bed, and pressed herself against the wall near the kitchen doorway, straining to hear over the frantic pounding of her own pulse. The scraping continued for what felt like an eternity, and then, with a soft, splintering crack, the old lock gave way. The back door creaked open, and a shadow moved into the darkened kitchen, the beam of a small flashlight sweeping across the floor and walls. Clara held her breath, pressed flat against the wall just outside the kitchen, gripping her own flashlight like a weapon, uncertain whether to attack, flee, or remain frozen, and hoped the intruder would search and leave without discovering her. The shadow moved further into the room, pausing near the fireplace, and Clara watched in horror as the beam of light settled directly on the loose floorboard hiding her father's box. Whoever this was, they knew exactly where to look. Clara's mind raced through her limited options. The front door stood only a few feet away, but reaching it would require crossing directly in front of the kitchen doorway, risking discovery. The upstairs loft offered no real escape, merely a dead end. She realized with sudden clarity, only one real advantage: the intruder did not yet know she was home. She made a decision in an instant, driven by desperation and adrenaline rather than careful planning. She switched on her flashlight and aimed it directly through the kitchen doorway, catching the intruder full in its beam. "Get out of my house," Clara said, forcing every ounce of courage she possessed into a voice that came out far steadier than she felt. The intruder spun around, momentarily blinded, one gloved hand rising instinctively to shield their eyes. For a split second, in the wash of flashlight beams crossing each other in the darkness, Clara caught a glimpse of a face, young, male, unfamiliar, before the figure turned and bolted for the broken back door, shoving past the frame and vanishing into the darkness of the field beyond. Clara stood frozen for a long moment, flashlight still trembling in her outstretched hand, listening to the sound of running footsteps fading into the night, followed a moment later by the distant roar of a car engine starting somewhere near the edge of the property and speeding away down the dirt track. Only when the silence returned, complete and heavy, did Clara allow herself to sink slowly to the floor, her legs no longer able to support the weight of adrenaline draining rapidly out of her body. She sat there for several minutes, shaking, before finally forcing herself to move, to check the floorboard, relieved to find the metal box still safely hidden beneath it, apparently undiscovered despite how close the intruder had come. With trembling hands, she called Walter, her voice cracking as she explained what had happened. He arrived within 20 minutes, Margie beside him, both of them grim-faced as they surveyed the broken lock and the disturbed dust near the fireplace where the intruder's flashlight beam had lingered. "That settles it," Walter said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You're not staying out here alone another night, not until we know exactly what we're dealing with and exactly who sent that young man to break into your home." Clara, still trembling from the encounter, found herself unable to disagree. "Do you think it was Ashcroft, or someone connected to Margaret?" "I don't know," Walter admitted. "But whoever it was, they knew precisely where to look for something hidden. That means someone with real information, not just rumors, sent them here tonight. And that, Clara, is the most worrying part of all." As Margie helped Clara gather her few belongings for another night at their farm, Clara glanced back one final time at the old farmhouse, its broken door hanging open to the darkness, and felt a fierce, unexpected resolve harden inside her chest, burning away the last of her fear and replacing it with something closer to determination. Whatever her father had hidden beneath Hollow Creek, whoever wanted it badly enough to break into her home in the dead of night, she intended to find it first, and she intended to understand, once and for all, exactly what truth her father had spent his entire life protecting. Morning could not come quickly enough. Morning arrived gray and overcast, storm clouds gathering on the horizon, as though the sky itself sensed the tension building across the county. Clara returned to Hollow Creek with Walter and Margie shortly after sunrise, accompanied this time by a local sheriff's deputy named Gareth Miles, whom Walter had insisted on calling the previous night despite Clara's initial reluctance to involve law enforcement in a matter so tangled with old family secrets and buried fortunes. Deputy Miles inspected the broken back door with a professional eye, photographing the damaged lock and taking careful notes as Clara described the intruder, his approximate age, the brief glimpse she had caught of his face in the crossing beams of their flashlights. "Doesn't match anyone I know off the top of my head," the deputy admitted, closing his notebook. "But I'll ask around, and I'll have a car swing past this property a few times a day for the time being. Miss Bennett, If you don't mind me saying, whatever's going on out here seems bigger than a simple break-in. You might want to consider exactly what you're protecting and whether it's worth the risk of staying." "It's worth it," Clara said firmly, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. After the deputy departed, promising to increase patrols along County Road 9, Walter retrieved a set of proper digging tools from his truck: shovels, a pickaxe, and a length of sturdy rope. Along with 2 more pairs of hands he had recruited that morning: his own farmhand, a broad-shouldered young man named Peter, and Desmond Hale, who had returned once more, curiosity apparently overcoming his usual reserve. "If we're doing this," Walter said, surveying the small group gathered near the wooden stake marking the first excavation point, "we're doing it properly, and we're doing it fast. I don't like the idea of leaving fresh dug earth sitting out here overnight for anyone else to notice." They began digging shortly after the deputy's car disappeared down the road, the overcast sky holding back its threatened rain just long enough for steady progress. Clara worked alongside the others, her hands blistering within the first hour despite the leather gloves Margie had insisted she wear, but she refused every offer to rest, driven by an urgency that would not allow her to sit idle while the answer to her father's lifelong secret lay somewhere beneath her feet. The first hole, dug nearly 4 feet down, revealed nothing but undisturbed clay and stone, an apparent dead end that left the group exchanging worried glances as the afternoon wore on. The second location, marked according to Desmond's calculations roughly 30 feet from the well in the opposite direction, proved equally fruitless after another exhausting hour of digging. "There's a third point," Desmond said, consulting the map again, wiping sweat and dirt from his brow. "Closer to the well itself, almost directly beneath the old stone structure. If your father hid something valuable, hiding it near an existing landmark that no one would think to disturb makes a certain kind of sense." They moved to the base of the old well, and Walter, after studying the ancient stonework carefully, pointed to a section of the well's foundation where the mortar between stones appeared newer, less weathered, than the surrounding structure. "This section's been repaired at some point," he said. "Recently, relatively speaking. Within the last few decades, not the century or more the rest of this well has stood." Working carefully now, mindful of the well's structural integrity, they began clearing earth away from the base of the stonework, and within 20 minutes, Peter's shovel struck something that rang out with a distinctly metallic sound, entirely different from the dull thud of stone or the soft give of clay. Everyone froze. "Careful," Desmond warned, kneeling to brush away loose soil by hand. "Slow now. Whatever this is, we don't want to damage it before we even know what we're looking at." They worked in tense silence for the next half hour, clearing earth away by hand from what gradually revealed itself to be a heavy iron hatch, roughly 3 feet square, set into a concrete foundation buried beneath the well, clearly constructed with far more engineering skill than a simple hole dug by a single man with a shovel. Clara stared down at the hatch, at the rusted iron ring set into its center, and felt her breath catch in her throat. "That's not something one person builds alone," Walter said quietly, echoing her own thoughts. "Your father had help constructing this, Clara." "Serious help." With considerable effort, Walter and Peter worked together to pry the heavy hatch loose from decades of accumulated rust and earth, the hinges groaning in protest as they finally gave way, revealing a dark opening below, and the top rungs of a metal ladder descending into blackness. A cold, damp draft rose up from the opening, carrying with it the smell of old stone and stagnant air undisturbed for decades. Clara stared down into the darkness, her heart pounding with equal parts terror and overwhelming anticipation. "I'm going down," she said. "Absolutely not alone," Walter said firmly. "I'll go first. If this structure hasn't collapsed after all these years, it should hold, but I want to be certain before you follow." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist that this discovery, her father's lifelong secret, belonged to her to uncover first. But the practical wisdom in Walter's caution overruled her impatience, and she watched, tense with anticipation, as he descended the ladder rung by rung into the darkness below, a powerful flashlight clutched in one hand. "It's solid," his voice called up after a long, breathless minute. "Concrete walls, properly reinforced. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. Come on down, but careful on the ladder. Some of these rungs feel a bit loose." Clara descended next, her pulse hammering with every rung, Desmond and Peter following close behind while Margie remained above, keeping watch over the property in case anyone approached unexpectedly. The ladder led down perhaps 12 feet into a narrow concrete chamber, and as Clara's feet touched solid ground, Walter swept his flashlight beam across the space, illuminating what lay before them. The chamber extended further than Clara had expected, a rectangular room roughly the size of a modest bedroom, its walls lined with reinforced concrete that had clearly been engineered to withstand decades underground. Along one wall stood a row of heavy metal shelving units, and stacked upon them, gleaming faintly in the beam of the flashlight, sat row upon row of gold bars, each one stamped with markings Clara did not recognize, alongside several smaller chests whose contents remained unknown. No one spoke for a long moment. The only sound in the chamber was the soft drip of water somewhere in the darkness, and the ragged breathing of 4 people standing in stunned silence before a fortune that had waited decades, hidden beneath a field everyone believed to be worthless. "Lord Almighty," Walter finally breathed, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as he swept it across the gleaming rows of gold. "Edmund, you old fox. You really did it." Clara stepped forward slowly, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch the surface of the nearest gold bar, half expecting it to dissolve into illusion the moment she made contact. It remained solid, cold, undeniably real beneath her touch, and she felt tears welling in her eyes, though whether from shock, relief, or the overwhelming grief of finally understanding the burden her father had carried alone for so many years, she could not have said. "There's more," Desmond called out, his flashlight illuminating a second section of the chamber where a locked metal filing cabinet stood against the far wall, alongside a small wooden desk bearing a stack of papers protected within a sealed glass case, clearly placed there deliberately to preserve them against the damp underground air. Clara moved toward the desk, her heart still racing, and peered through the glass at the documents beneath. Property deeds, investment records, correspondence between several names she did not recognize and one she did, Reginald Ashcroft. Whatever the true history of this fortune, whatever dispute had torn her father and Nathaniel's grandfather apart decades earlier, the answers lay here, preserved and waiting, in this hidden chamber beneath a field that the entire world had dismissed as worthless. "We need to document everything before we move anything," Desmond said, his surveyor's careful instincts taking over even amid the shock of discovery. "Photographs, an inventory, all of it properly recorded. If there's any legal dispute coming, and given everything you've told me about this Ashcroft fellow, I'd wager there is, you'll want an unimpeachable record of exactly what you found, and exactly how you found it." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes and forcing herself to focus despite the overwhelming rush of emotion threatening to overtake her. "You're right. We do this carefully, and we do it quietly. No one outside this room hears about this until I understand exactly what we're dealing with." As they began the painstaking work of photographing the chamber and its contents, Clara's mind kept returning to her father's final letter, to the 7 words that had started this entire journey. "Everything I could not say is there." He had not simply meant the gold, she realized, standing amid the glinting fortune he had protected for decades at tremendous personal cost. He had meant all of it, the truth about Reginald Ashcroft, the reason he had married Margaret and kept this secret hidden even from his own new family, the years of quiet fear he had carried alone rather than risk his daughter's safety. Whatever the full truth turned out to be, Clara understood now that uncovering it would require far more than simply finding the gold. It would require finally exposing every lie that had surrounded her family for years, including, she suspected with growing certainty, whatever role Margaret herself had played in her father's final, troubled months. Above them, muffled through 12 feet of earth and concrete, Margie's voice suddenly called down through the open hatch, sharp with alarm. "Walter, someone's coming up the drive fast." Clara scrambled up the ladder first, her heart hammering, adrenaline overriding the ache in her blistered hands as she climbed toward the gray daylight above. She emerged from the hatch to find Margie standing rigid near the well, staring down the dirt track toward the main road, where a cloud of dust marked the approach of a fast-moving vehicle. "It's him," Margie said grimly, "the Ashcroft fellow. Recognize that car anywhere." Walter climbed out behind Clara, followed quickly by Desmond and Peter, all four of them exchanging urgent glances as the black car sped up the drive and skidded to a stop near the farmhouse. Nathaniel Ashcroft stepped out, no longer wearing the pleasant, rehearsed smile from their first encounter. His expression now was hard, focused, and behind him, two more men climbed out of the vehicle, both considerably larger and less interested in pleasantries than Nathaniel himself had been. "Miss Bennet," Nathaniel called out, striding toward the group with purposeful steps. "I think it's time we stopped pretending you don't know exactly what's hidden on this property." Clara stepped forward, positioning herself between Nathaniel and the open hatch behind her, though she knew the gesture offered little real protection against three determined men. "This is private property, Mr. Ashcroft. You need to leave." "I intend to," Nathaniel said, "just as soon as we've settled our business. I've had someone watching this property for the better part of a week, Miss Bennet. I know exactly what your friends have been digging up this morning." His eyes flicked past her toward the open hatch, and something greedy and dangerous sparked behind them. "My family has waited 3 decades for what belongs to us. I won't wait any longer while you and your neighbors quietly claim it for yourselves." "Nothing here belongs to you," Walter said firmly, stepping up beside Clara, his broad frame a wall of quiet, immovable resolve. "Whatever business you had with Edmund, it's between the two of them, long settled by the courts, sealed and finished. You have no legal claim to anything on this land." "Legal claim," Nathaniel repeated, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "My grandfather spent his final years fighting for a legal claim and died with nothing to show for it, cheated by a man who buried the truth as deeply as he buried his gold. I'm not interested in legal claims anymore, Mr. Higgins. I'm interested in what's fair." One of the larger men behind Nathaniel took a step forward, and Clara felt her pulse spike with real fear for the first time, understanding with sudden clarity that this confrontation could turn dangerous very quickly if she did not find a way to defuse it. "Wait," Clara said, raising both hands, forcing herself to sound calmer than she felt. "Before anyone does anything they'll regret, there's something you should know. There are documents down there, Mr. Ashcroft. Records of the original investment, correspondence between your grandfather and my father. If you truly believe you're owed something, the proof of that claim, one way or another, is sitting in that chamber right now. Destroying this situation with threats accomplishes nothing except making sure none of us ever get the truth." Nathaniel studied her for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing his options, the greed and grievance warring visibly behind his eyes against whatever remained of his more calculated instincts. "Show me," he said finally. "Not until you send your men back to the car," Clara said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm not showing anyone anything while I'm outnumbered and threatened on my own property." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder from the gathering storm clouds. Finally, Nathaniel gestured sharply, and the two men retreated several paces back toward the black car, though they did not climb inside, remaining close enough to intervene should the situation demand it. Clara led Nathaniel to the edge of the hatch, Walter following close behind, clearly unwilling to leave her alone with the man for even a moment. She gestured down toward the ladder. "The documents are inside a sealed case on a desk near the back of the chamber. I haven't gone through all of them yet, but there's correspondence with your grandfather's name on it." Nathaniel descended the ladder first, Clara following close behind, both of them emerging into the chamber where Desmond and Peter had continued their careful photographic documentation, pausing in surprise at Nathaniel's unexpected arrival. Nathaniel's eyes widened as he took in the full sight of the gold bars gleaming beneath the flashlight beams, and for a moment, all the careful calculation drained from his expression, replaced by something closer to raw, unguarded shock. "He really did it," Nathaniel murmured, echoing almost exactly what Walter had said hours earlier. 30 years, and he really kept it here the entire time. Clara moved to the sealed glass case and carefully lifted it open, extracting the stack of documents within. She handed them to Nathaniel without a word, watching his expression carefully as he began to read, his eyes scanning rapidly across pages that had waited decades to be seen. The documents told a far more complicated story than either Nathaniel or Clara had expected. A letter from Edmund to Reginald Ashcroft, dated some 32 years earlier, detailed the original investment arrangement between several partners, and a subsequent letter, written perhaps a year later, revealed that Reginald himself had attempted to withdraw the entire combined fortune for his own personal use during a moment of financial desperation, an act that would have left the other partners, including Edmund, with nothing at all. Edmund had discovered the attempt and moved the fortune to protect it, not to steal it outright as the Ashcroft family had believed for 3 decades, but specifically to prevent Reginald from taking more than his rightful share. "This isn't what my grandfather told my father," Nathaniel said slowly, his voice hollow with dawning realization. "He always said Edmund cheated him, took everything for himself out of pure greed." "Maybe your grandfather believed that," Clara said quietly, watching the documents shift Nathaniel's entire understanding of a story his family had carried as grievance for 30 years. "Or maybe he simply never told your father, or you, the whole truth. Either way, it seems clear my father protected this fortune from being stolen by one man, not from being fairly shared among partners who deserved their portion." Nathaniel read through several more pages in silence, his shoulders gradually sagging under the weight of a family history he had believed absolutely, and had come here today willing to threaten violence over, only to discover it had never been entirely true. "There's a final accounting here," Desmond said, pointing to a separate ledger he had discovered among the papers. "Looks like your father kept detailed records of every partner's rightful share, Miss Bennet, including a portion clearly marked for Reginald Ashcroft's family, set aside and untouched, waiting, it seems, for exactly this kind of reckoning." Clara took the ledger and studied the careful, meticulous handwriting, her father's hand once again, recording numbers and names with the same precision he had brought to the map and the hidden chamber itself. A significant portion of the gold, clearly separated from the rest, bore a small handwritten note beside it, "For Reginald's family, when the truth can finally be told." She looked up at Nathaniel, who stood frozen, staring at the note as though it had physically struck him. "He set aside your family's share," Clara said softly. "He never intended to keep it all for himself. He was protecting it, waiting for a moment when the danger and the dispute had settled enough to finally make things right." Nathaniel lowered the document slowly, his earlier hostility replaced by something far more complicated, grief and shame, and a lifetime of misplaced anger all tangled together behind his eyes. "I came here today ready to take this by force if I had to," he admitted quietly. "My whole life, I believed your father stole everything from my family out of pure greed. I never imagined there might be more to the story." "There's always more to the story," Clara said, thinking not only of Reginald Ashcroft and her father's old dispute, but of Margaret's cold cruelty, of Vivian's sudden, suspicious warmth, of an entire family history that seemed to grow more tangled and complicated with every discovery. "I think we both have some difficult truths to work through, Mr. Ashcroft, but I don't think either of us has to work through them alone or as enemies." Above them, thunder rumbled again, closer now, and the first heavy drops of rain began pattering against the ground near the open hatch. Nathaniel handed the documents back to Clara with visibly trembling hands, and for the first time since their initial encounter, his expression held no trace of threat or calculation, only the raw uncertainty of a man whose entire understanding of his own family's history had just been fundamentally rewritten. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "for today and for how I approached you before. I let 30 years of my family's bitterness cloud everything, without ever stopping to question whether the story I'd been told was actually true." "We'll figure out what's fair," Clara said. "Together, properly, with lawyers and documentation, not threats and men waiting by cars. But first, I need to understand something else, something that's been troubling me since I found this place. My father's letter mentioned that Margaret, my stepmother, might be closer to the truth than he intended. I need to know if your family had any contact with her, any arrangement I should know about." Nathaniel shook his head slowly. "Not that I'm aware of. My investigation into this property was entirely my own, based on old family records and rumors I'd chased down myself over the past several months. I've never met your stepmother." Clara absorbed this information with a growing sense of unease. If Nathaniel's pursuit of Hollow Creek's secret had been entirely independent of Margaret, then whatever her father had feared about Margaret's proximity to the truth represented an entirely separate danger, one Clara had not yet begun to understand, and one that, given Margaret's ruthless treatment of her following the funeral, felt far more personally threatening than even Nathaniel Ashcroft's desperate grasping for a fortune he had misunderstood for 30 years. The rain began falling in earnest now, drumming against the field above them, and Clara understood, standing amid her father's carefully hidden fortune with a former enemy turned uncertain ally beside her, that the true danger to everything she had uncovered might still be waiting, patiently, back at the mansion she had once called home. In the days that followed, Clara worked with a lawyer named Priya Kapoor, recommended by Desmond as someone sharp, thorough, and entirely unafraid of powerful clients on the opposing side. Priya reviewed the documents recovered from the underground chamber with careful, methodical attention, cross-referencing dates, signatures, and financial records against the public filings from Edmund's estate. It was during this review, 3 days after the confrontation with Nathaniel Ashcroft, that Priya uncovered something that turned Clara's stomach cold with a fresh, more personal kind of betrayal. "Look at this," Priya said, spreading 2 documents side by side across her office desk. "This is a copy of your father's original will, filed 8 months before his death, and this is the amended version, filed only 3 weeks before he passed, the one that left the mansion and company shares to Margaret and Vivian, and Hollow Creek to you." Clara studied the 2 documents, her eyes moving between them. "They look similar. What am I missing?" "The signature," Priya said, pointing to Edmund's handwriting at the bottom of each page. "Compare the pressure, the consistency of the strokes. Your father was gravely ill by the time this amended version was signed, according to his medical records, which I obtained through the estate proceedings. Look how steady this second signature is, compared to what you'd expect from a man in his condition. And this witness listed here, a notary named Franklin Doyle, I've already confirmed his license was suspended for improper notarization practices just 2 months after this document was signed." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "You're saying the amended will was fraudulent?" "I'm saying it deserves serious scrutiny," Priya said carefully. "Combined with the medical records showing your father's declining cognitive state during his final weeks, and the timing of this amendment occurring so close to his death, there's a strong argument for undue influence, potentially even outright fraud, especially if we can establish that Margaret had direct involvement in arranging this notary and pressuring your father during a period when he may not have been fully capable of understanding what he was signing." Clara sat back in her chair, the full weight of what Priya was suggesting settling over her slowly. Margaret had not simply taken advantage of a fair inheritance system that happened to favor her. She had, it seemed, actively manipulated a dying man in his most vulnerable final weeks, securing the mansion and the company for herself and Vivian through means that were, at best, ethically questionable, and at worst, criminal. "Can we prove it?" Clara asked. "We can build a strong case," Priya said. "I'd want to interview the household staff who were present during those final weeks, review any correspondence between Margaret and this notary, Franklin Doyle, and potentially bring in a medical expert to testify about your father's cognitive state during that period. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy, especially given Margaret's resources and connections. But yes, Clara, I believe we can build a case strong enough to challenge the amended will and potentially recover what was rightfully taken from you." Over the following 2 weeks, Priya's investigation gathered momentum. A former housekeeper, dismissed by Margaret shortly after Edmund's death under circumstances the woman described as suspiciously abrupt, came forward with an account of witnessing Margaret pressuring Edmund repeatedly during his final weeks, insisting he needed to settle his affairs properly, while he was too weak and confused to fully understand the documents being placed in front of him. Financial records revealed a series of payments from Margaret's personal account to Franklin Doyle in the weeks surrounding the will amendment, payments Margaret had never adequately explained on her own tax filings. Clara returned to Hollow Creek periodically throughout this period, working alongside Walter, Peter, and a small, trusted team. Priya had helped arrange to properly and legally document the chamber's contents, transferring the gold and remaining assets into secured storage, while the estate's legal complications worked their way through the courts. Nathaniel Ashcroft, true to his word after their confrontation, cooperated fully with the process, providing his family's old records to help establish the fair division of the original investment, his earlier hostility replaced by a cautious, evolving respect for Clara's determination to see the matter resolved honestly for everyone involved, not merely to her own advantage. It was Priya who finally arranged the formal confrontation, insisting that any resolution required Margaret and Vivian to be presented directly with the evidence, both to give them a fair opportunity to respond and to establish, clearly and on the record, that Clara's challenge to the will was neither frivolous nor motivated by simple resentment. They met at Priya's office on a bright, clear afternoon nearly 3 weeks after Clara's eviction from the only home she had ever known. Margaret arrived dressed impeccably as always, though Clara noticed a new tightness around her eyes, a wariness that had not been present during their last encounter on the porch. Vivian trailed behind her mother, uncharacteristically quiet, her earlier phone call warmth nowhere in evidence now that she stood facing Clara across a conference table stacked with documents. "I don't understand why we're here," Margaret said coolly, taking her seat with practiced composure. "If this is some attempt to contest your father's clearly stated final wishes, I should warn you, our family's lawyers are considerably more experienced than whatever counsel you've managed to scrape together. I'd encourage you to review what we've gathered before making that assessment," Priya said evenly, sliding a folder across the table. "Copies of the original and amended wills, financial records connecting you directly to Franklin Doyle, whose notary license was suspended shortly after witnessing your husband's amended signature, a sworn statement from your former housekeeper describing the pressure you placed on Edmund during his final, most vulnerable weeks." Margaret's composed expression flickered, just barely, as she opened the folder and began reading. Vivian leaned over to read alongside her, and Clara watched her stepsister's face drain of color as the full weight of the evidence became clear. "This is absurd," Margaret said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Edmund signed that will of his own free will. I never pressured him into anything." "The housekeeper's statement suggests otherwise," Priya said calmly. "As do the payment records to Mr. Doyle, which you'll notice we've already forwarded to the State Notary Licensing Board for their independent review. Given his previous suspension involved remarkably similar circumstances with another elderly client." Clara watched Margaret's carefully constructed composure begin to crack in real time, The cold confidence that had dismissed her so easily on that porch weeks earlier, now visibly straining under the weight of evidence she had clearly never expected to surface. "What do you want, Clara?" Margaret finally asked, her voice tight and controlled, though something desperate flickered beneath the surface. "You found your father's little treasure out at that field, haven't you? Is that not enough for you? Must you also try to strip away everything your father left the rest of his family as well?" "I don't want to destroy you, Margaret," Clara said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it. "I want the truth acknowledged. I want what my father actually intended before he was too sick and too pressured to protect his own wishes, respected properly. If that means the mansion and the company remain with you and Vivian fairly, without coercion clouding the matter, I can accept that. But I won't accept a will built on manipulation of a dying man, especially not from someone who threw me out onto the street within hours of burying him." A long silence stretched across the conference table. Vivian, who had remained quiet throughout the confrontation, finally spoke, her voice small and uncertain in a way Clara had never heard from her before. "Mother," Vivian said slowly, "did you actually do what they're saying? Did you really pressure him at the end when he was that sick?" Margaret's eyes flashed toward her daughter, a warning flickering behind them, but Vivian did not look away this time, waiting for an answer with an intensity that suggested even she had not fully known the extent of her mother's actions. "I did what was necessary to secure our family's future," Margaret said finally, her voice cold and clipped. "Edmund would have left everything in chaos otherwise, dividing assets between a company that needed stable leadership and a stepdaughter with no experience running anything. I made sure our family was protected." "By manipulating a dying man," Clara said quietly. "By locking me out of the only home I'd ever known within hours of his funeral, while you already knew exactly how you'd secured everything for yourself." Margaret said nothing, her silence more damning than any denial could have been. Priya cleared her throat, drawing the tense conversation back toward practical matters. "Given the strength of the evidence, and the reputational and legal exposure this creates for both of you, I'd strongly recommend we discuss a settlement rather than allowing this to proceed to a full public trial, which would almost certainly result in criminal referral given the notary fraud involved, in addition to the civil challenge to the will itself." Over the following hour, difficult, tense negotiations unfolded across the conference table, Margaret's confidence eroding further with each concession Priya's evidence forced her to make. By the time the meeting finally concluded, an agreement had taken shape. The amended will would be formally set aside, replaced by terms closer to Edmund's original documented wishes, with Clara receiving a fair and legally recognized share of the company and estate alongside Margaret and Vivian, while Margaret agreed, in exchange for avoiding a public criminal referral regarding the notary fraud, to relinquish sole control of the mansion and step down from any executive role within Edmund's company. As the meeting ended and Margaret gathered her things to leave, her composure finally, completely broken, she paused beside Clara, her voice low enough that only the two of them could hear. "You think you've won something," Margaret said quietly. "But you'll spend the rest of your life being the girl whose own family had to be dragged through court to treat her fairly. That's not a victory, Clara. That's just a different kind of loneliness." Clara met her stepmother's gaze steadily, feeling, for the first time in weeks, something like genuine peace settle over her chest. "Maybe," she said, "but at least it's a loneliness built on the truth instead of a family built on lies. I'll take that trade." Margaret said nothing more. She turned and walked out of the office, Vivian trailing uncertainly behind her, and Clara watched them go, understanding that whatever relationship might have once existed between them, however thin and imperfect it had truly been, was now permanently, irrevocably finished. She turned to Priya, who was already gathering the signed settlement documents into a neat folder. "It's really over." "The legal side, yes," Priya said. "The rest, the harder part, figuring out what comes next, that's entirely up to you now, Clara." Clara thought of the gold still sitting in secure storage, of the fair share now legally recognized as belonging to both herself and the Ashcroft family, of the field at Hollow Creek that had once seemed worthless and had turned out to hold not only her father's fortune, but the truth he had spent decades protecting. She thought of Walter and Margie's simple, unwavering kindness, of Desmond's quiet expertise, of Nathaniel's slow transformation from threat to uncertain ally. Whatever came next, she understood now, she would not be facing it as the powerless, grieving girl locked out on that porch weeks earlier. She would be facing it as someone who had uncovered the truth, protected it against every threat, and finally claimed what was rightfully hers, not through cruelty or manipulation, but through patience, courage, and an unwillingness to give up even when everything seemed lost. "I know exactly what comes next," she said, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt something that had been missing for weeks finally return to her voice. Genuine, unshakable hope. 6 months later, Clara stood once again at the edge of the field she had first walked into as a grieving, penniless young woman with nothing but a suitcase and a folded piece of paper. The tall grass had been cleared now, replaced by neat rows of new fencing and the beginnings of a proper garden near the restored farmhouse, its walls freshly painted, its broken shutter long since repaired. The old well still stood at the center of the property, though the hidden chamber beneath it had been carefully sealed once more, its contents relocated to secure, properly documented storage as the legal distribution of Edmund's true fortune continued its slow, careful progress through the courts and negotiations that Priya still managed with tireless precision. The settlement with Margaret had held, formal and binding, and though Clara rarely saw her stepmother anymore, she had heard, through the quiet channels of a small town's persistent gossip, that Margaret's reputation among her old social circle had suffered considerably once word of the notary fraud investigation became impossible to fully contain. Vivian, to Clara's genuine surprise, had reached out again several weeks after the settlement, this time without any trace of her old calculating warmth, offering instead a quiet, uncertain apology for the years of casual cruelty and the events surrounding their father's death. Clara had accepted the apology cautiously, understanding that trust, once broken so thoroughly, could not be rebuilt overnight, but choosing, deliberately, to leave the door open rather than closing it forever the way Margaret so clearly had with her. The arrangement with the Ashcroft family had settled more smoothly than Clara had initially dared hope. Nathaniel, once he fully absorbed the truth of his grandfather's original betrayal and Edmund's genuine effort to protect his family's rightful share, had become an unexpectedly steady presence throughout the legal proceedings, his family's portion of the recovered fortune finally, properly delivered after 3 decades of misplaced grievance and suspicion. He visited Hollow Creek occasionally now, usually alongside Walter and Desmond, the 4 of them having settled into an easy, unlikely friendship forged in the strange crucible of buried gold and old family secrets. Clara had made a decision in the weeks following the settlement that surprised even herself. Rather than selling Hollow Creek and using her share of the recovered fortune to build a comfortable, anonymous life somewhere far from the county's tangled history, she had chosen to stay, to rebuild the farmhouse, to restore the land her father had protected so carefully for so many decades. And she had chosen to do something more with the fortune than simply enrich herself. She stood now at the entrance to a newly constructed building near the edge of the property, its sign freshly painted. The Edmund Bennett Foundation, offering support and resources for women rebuilding their lives after sudden loss or family upheaval. It had been Margie's idea, originally, offered gently one evening over dinner months earlier, when Clara had confessed how close she had come to true despair during those first desperate days after Margaret locked her out with nothing but a suitcase and a single photograph. "You had people who helped you," Margie had said. "Not everyone does. Maybe that's worth building something for." The foundation had grown faster than Clara ever expected, drawing volunteers and modest donations from across the county, its first small cohort of women already settling into temporary housing, arranged on a portion of the property, receiving guidance and resources to help them rebuild careers, homes, and lives disrupted by circumstances entirely beyond their control. Clara found, in the quiet satisfaction of watching strangers find their footing again, a sense of purpose that no amount of gold alone could have ever provided. Walter approached from across the field as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, wiping dust from his hands, a broad smile spreading across his weathered face. New arrivals settling in all right. They are, Clara said, watching two women unload boxes near the small guest cottages built along the property's eastern edge. It's strange, you know. A year ago I stood right here with nothing, certain my life had fallen completely apart. And now, Walter asked. Clara looked out across the transformed field, at the neat fences and the restored farmhouse, and the foundation building rising proudly against the darkening sky, at the well that had once hidden her father's greatest secret, and now simply stood as a quiet monument to the truth he had finally, if belatedly, made possible for her to uncover. Now I understand something I didn't before, she said slowly. Everyone told me this land was worthless. My stepmother meant it as an insult, the cruelest thing she could give me. But my father knew better. He knew that what looked worthless on the surface could hold something far more valuable underneath if you were only patient enough and brave enough to dig deep enough to find it. Walter nodded, understanding passing silently between them in the comfortable way of people who had weathered genuine danger together and emerged, against considerable odds, not merely intact but stronger. Your father would be proud, Clara. Whatever else happened between him and Margaret, whatever mistakes he made keeping secrets for so long, I believe that much without any doubt at all. Clara smiled, feeling the weight of grief that had followed her for the past year finally settle into something gentler, something closer to peace than pain. She thought of her father's final letter, of the 7 words that had started this entire journey, and understood now, standing amid everything that had grown from that single buried box beneath a well in a forgotten field, exactly what he had truly meant. Everything I could not say is there. He had not simply meant the gold, or the documents, or even the truth about Reginald Ashcroft's old betrayal. He had meant this, the chance for his daughter to build something real and lasting from the ashes of everything that had been taken from her, to transform an inheritance meant as an insult into a foundation of genuine, hard-won strength. As the sun sank lower, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold that seemed fittingly to echo the fortune that had once lain hidden beneath this very ground, Clara Bennett stood at the center of the life she had built for herself. No longer the grieving, powerless girl locked out on a stranger's porch, but a woman who had faced betrayal, danger, and loss, and had emerged patiently and deliberately into something far stronger and far more valuable than anyone, including herself, had ever believed possible. The field that everyone had once called worthless had given her everything that truly mattered, not merely gold, but truth, purpose, and a life finally, fully her own.